Welcome back. It is June 17 of 2015. We get a chance to take a look at Brentano's fifth lesson on his phenomenology or descriptive psychology. We are moving on to the level of reflection and positing of the truth at the dialogue threshold. We've already looked at the positing of the sign model. Now we're going to look at the refinement of the sign model to becoming proto-concepts or formal concepts. We begin to, Brentano tells us what's the task at the dialogue threshold. We search for analogous relation and generalities in order to raise our sign model to its first proto-conceptual status. And we address each separate determination for quality and spatial determination. And we also want to refine the connections between the separable parts, the structure. And some groupings will actually evolve to abbreviated subsystems. Our dialogue centers on positing probabilities at this level, which we are experimentally testing and refining. So it is a time of positing probabilities. Now our task will address a multi-dimensional continuum, says Brentano, for ascertaining the truth of belief. The separable phenomenal parts give the impression of possessing borders, but these borders bleed into each other. There's also a pervading presence of the individualizing factor. This is important for this lesson because later he's going to discuss this under the heading of Proterosis, which Brentano forms into a compound of Proterosis aesthetic stance. And we can conclude, therefore, at this point, that our dialogue addresses individualized elements that have been imprinted with an intentionality, a personalized or individualized intentionality. So the dialogue threshold will address a die-energia. We address two planes of modality at the threshold. We address, in our dialogue, primary relatedness and secondary relatedness, which is basically concerned with judgments of belief and truth. Feeling percepts also accompany every individualized element of our model. There's also a feeling percept that accompanies it, our feeling of being favorable toward it or negative toward it. So the de-energia is engaged along two planes of reciprocal discourse, fundamental and superimposed. This is the key to refinement for Brentano. The fundamental plane of discourse at the dialogue threshold addresses judgments concerning the sensory data. Now, here's the key. Point 2. The Proterosis aesthetic stance is considered part of the sensory originary plane and the sensory originary data. It's equal to the motivational-based stance that every individual carries to any encounter with objectivity, to any discourse at the dialogue threshold. We all carry a motivational base, a leaning, a kind of a slant or our stance toward reality, kind of an internal filter that we all carry. We all carry that. We all have that emotive or motivational leaning toward the truth that we believe in, and we carry that. We all carry that motivational base. Well, that stance is what Brentano describes as a Proterosis aesthetic stance. It's been called in postmodern era the phronetic stance. It's been given a different name in the postmodern era, but Brentano called it the Proterosis aesthetic stance. It's part of that originary plane, that sensory data, because all sensation is gathered within the boundary of that Proterosis aesthetic stance. We gather all of our sensory data through that filter we carry, through that leaning toward reality that we all carry. And so this is that individualizing factor that Brentano spoke of earlier. This is the individualizing factor. It is our individual leaning in toward reality that we always carry. Our individual leaning in toward the dialogue threshold. Before we speak a single word, we're already leaning in with a motivational tilt, a motivational intent. Now the superimposed plane of discourse, along this plane, dialogue addresses the judgments of belief concerning truth. The fundamental plane provides the resources of evidence, but at this level we self-reflectively debate the first primitive belief and refine it through reflective and reflexive reasoning. So we end up in the second level, we want to imprint the first level. We're taking the sensory data, but in the superimposed level or modality, we're addressing belief and how do we get beyond, or how do we reinforce that first primitive belief of our sign model? Do we accept it? Do we reinforce it? Do we challenge it? It's always how do we address that first primitive originary belief. But it's always in response to the resources of that first plane of the fundamental plane of discourse, which is sensory, but it's sensory within that initial boundary of our own frenetic stance or motivational based stance, which for Brentano it's a Proterosis aesthetic stance. He kind of gives it he gives it almost a poetic quality. He kind of takes a look at it as not simply an intellectual leaning in toward reality, but it's an intellectual and a poetic leaning in toward reality combined. That's why he uses the term that he uses. He keys in on Proterosis because that means it's a primary. It's a prior to the gathering of sensory data. So he wants to emphasize the fact that it is a prior stance. Before any sensory data is gathered, it becomes the border of gathering and the filter of gathering. But it's an intellectual leaning in, and it is a poetic leaning in. That's why he uses aesthetic along with that Proterosis aesthetic stance. So he kind of combines the aspect of it being the originary leaning in by the agent, and it is intellectual, it is motivational, also emotional, almost poetic. It does count as kind of a filter for gathering sensory data. In postmodern era, it's called phronesis or phronetic stance, and it just really emphasizes our original intentionality. And so it kind of goes along with Brentano's idea that everything is coupled with intentionality, even at the area, the level of the intuitive gathering of percepts. Intentionality is always present. Well, of course it is. If we always have that originary frenetic stance, that border, that filter we kind of contain, that leaning in, that intellectual and poetic leaning in, it will always qualify any gathering of percepts with an imprint of intentionality. And that's kind of what he's getting to when he uses that term of Proterosis. But he does make it a compound term to clarify Proterosis aesthetic stance. So it's another level. We've moved beyond sign model. Now we've moved into the area of actually reaching proto-conceptual analysis. We're moving into the conceptual now. We're not there yet, but we're getting into the notion of the true, the area where we actually write out, we actually define our notion of truth. But we haven't got there yet. We're almost there, but we haven't quite gotten there. We haven't quite reached the conceptual. We've reached the proto-conceptual, the first stage of emerging to the conceptual, but that emergence is along two modality planes, the fundamental and the superimposed. So that takes us up through page 9.